Erev Tov. Our guest, Professor Carlo Ginzburg, Professor Yosef Kaplan, ladies and gentlemen. I'll speak Hebrew because this is the Israel Academy of Sciences and Humanities, but afterwards everything else will be held in English. לכבוד רב הוא לי לפתוח היום את האירוע היום, שזאת ההרצאה השנתית על שם פרופסור מרטין בובר. ההרצאה זו היא פעילות של החטיבה למדעי הרוח באקדמיה, והיא מקבילה לפעילות דומה של החטיבה למדעי הטבע, דהיינו ההרצאה השנתית על שם אלברט איינשטיין. באמצעות שתי ההרצאות השנתיות האלה, זוכרת האקדמיה מדי שנה שני אישים דגולים שתרמו רבות לאנושות, וגם למדינת ישראל. בעוד שהרצאת איינשטיין מתקיימת מזה שנים רבות, ההרצאה על שם מרטין בובר היא פעילות חדשה יחסית באקדמיה שלנו. בשנה שעברה התקיימה ההרצאה הראשונה במסגרת זו, שניתנה על ידי פרופסור הברמאס, והיא הייתה מוקדשת למורשתו של פרופסור בובר. אנחנו שמחים לארח השנה את פרופסור קרלו גינסבורג. אינני חושבת שבאכסניה זו צריך להכביר מילים על דמותו של פרופסור מרטין בובר ופועלו. הוא היה הנשיא הראשון של האקדמיה מיד עם הקמתה בשנת 1960. הוא היה אחד הפילוסופים הדגולים והתפרסם בעיקר בזכות הפילוסופיה הדיאלוגית שהוא פיתח. ועל כך הרחיב את הדיבור פרופסור הברמאס בהרצאתו בשנה שעברה. תרומתו של פרופסור בובר בנושאים מגוונים כמו דתות, חינוך או פסיכולוגיה, אף היא זכתה להכרה רבה, ומחקריו נלמדים עד היום על ידי סטודנטים ברחבי העולם. לכבוד הוא לאקדמיה הלאומית למדעים לקיים את האירוע השנתי על שמו של פרופסור בובר, ואני מודה מאוד לפרופסור קרלו גינסבורג אשר נאות לשאת את ההרצאה בשנה זו. What I said in the last sentence is that it is our honor to hold this yearly lecture named after Professor Martin Buber, and even a special honor to have you as a guest to give the lecture this year. Sorry. And now I'll ask Professor Yosef Kaplan to introduce Professor Ginzburg.
It was a nice lapsus. Professor Ruth Arnon, Professor Carlo Ginzburg, ladies and gentlemen. Professor Carlo Ginzburg is one of the most important and original historians of our times. His books have aroused great interest in the Israeli Academy, and two of them have been translated into Hebrew. He has visited Israel several times, and he was the first guest lecturer in the Menachem Stern Jerusalem series in memory of Professor Stern, a member of the Israeli Academy of Sciences and Humanities, whose life was cruelly cut short 25 years ago. It is no simple task to describe the work of Carlo Ginzburg, a multifaceted historian whose research covers innumerable areas, relies upon a variety of disciplines, and is sustained by breathtaking erudition. Anyone who wishes to summarize his career in a few minutes knows in advance that he can discuss only a small part of the challenging body of historical work by a scholar who is widely regarded as the most self-reflective historian of our day. However, by following the threads and traces that Carlo Ginzburg has dispersed throughout his work, I shall try to outline some of the characteristics of his unique method. I will begin with his essay, Witches and Shamans, where he recalls his early 20s when he was a student at the University of Pisa and took it upon himself to write a study of witchcraft. It may have been the first time I am quoting Professor Carlo Ginzburg. It may have been the first time I really experienced what I would call the euphoria of ignorance, the sensation of not knowing anything, but being on the verge of beginning to learn something. I think that the intense pleasure associated with that moment helped to keep me from becoming a specialist, of delving into a well-defined or limited field of study. However, it's important to point out that his frequent movement to new subjects and areas is always bound up with renewal, with the meticulous reading of texts of various types, which for their part led him to other texts. As he said of himself in his book, No Island is an Island, it always began with a discovery originating on the fringe of a wholly different investigation. As he went on to write, quote unquote, from the Friulian miller Domenico Scandella, nicknamed Menocchio, I grasped that the way in which a human being appropriates his or her readings is frequently unpredictable. Ginzburg's way of reading is always surprising and sometimes paradoxical, similar to the reading of a detective who solves mysteries by concentrating on apparently trivial details. In his famous essay, Clues, Roots of an Evidential Paradigm, after discussing the parallels and connections among the methods of Giovanni Morelli, Sherlock Holmes, and Sigmund Freud, he wittily suggested that, quote unquote, in each case, infinitesimal traces permit the comprehension of a deeper, otherwise unattainable reality. Traces, more precisely symptoms in the case of Freud, clues in the case of Sherlock Holmes, pictorial marks in the case of Morelli. Just as he emphasized the special value of infinitesimal traces for revealing the reality behind the text, he also repeatedly states that in historical research, anomaly tells us more than the rule, because it speaks also of the rule, whereas the rule speaks only of itself. On a number of occasions, Ginzburg has mentioned his formative intellectual experience attending a seminar taught by Delio Cantimori on Burckhardt's Meditations on World History. Ginzburg was enchanted by the focus and meticulous reading directed by the great historian who was to become his admired teacher and mentor. Quote unquote, we read 20 lines in a week. For me, this exposure to slow reading was a revelation. Indeed, a reading that dwells upon short fragments and examines them closely has become one of the conspicuous traits of Ginzburg's historiography. In every one of his works, we are challenged by the invitation to engage in slow reading, a concentrating, penetrating examination that brings out new and often unexpected connections. Carlos Ginzburg was born in Turin in 1939. His father, Leone Ginzburg, was born in Odessa, was a wide-ranging intellectual who quickly mastered the Italian language and culture, which became a central factor in his identity. He taught Russian literature in the University of Turin until he lost his position in 1933 because he refused to swear allegiance to the fascist regime. Because of his anti-fascist activism, he was imprisoned for 2 years. In 1938, he married Natalia Levi, none other than the famous author Natalia Ginzburg. At the time their son Carlo was born, Leone Ginzburg lost his Italian citizenship because of their racial laws. Carlo spent the first years of his childhood in a small village in the Abruzzi region, to which his father was exiled in 1940, when Italy entered the war as an ally of Nazi Germany. Carlo Ginzburg, who was to become famous as one of the major researchers into Italian peasant culture in the early modern period, spent his childhood in a rather poor rural area where life was not very different from the life of the peasants in the Friuli region in the 16th century, who later became the subject of one of Ginzburg's most important studies. After the collapse of the fascist regime in July 1943, Leone Ginzburg returned to Rome, where he began to edit a clandestine magazine. A few months after the Germans entered Rome, he was arrested, having been identified as an anti-fascist Jew, and he was murdered in the Regina Coeli prison. Ginzburg says of himself, quote unquote, "I belong to a generation marked above all by the Second World War. Some of the main themes of The Cheese and the Worms, the challenge to authority, the persecution of minorities, are to a large extent a development of my first book, The Night Battles, which was also based on Inquisition trials and dealt with the persecution of religious minority. As I realized many years ago, recollections of having been persecuted as a Jew played an important role in my approach to history." On several occasions, Carlo Ginzburg has told about how, in his youth, when he was devouring novels and stories, he could not decide between becoming a writer or a painter, and he had not made up his mind whether to study art history or literature. The seminar he took with Cantimori and the great impression made by Marc Bloch's famous book, Le Roi Thaumaturge, made him decide in favor of history. But, as he said of himself, quote unquote, "In a more implicit way, I realized that I was walking in the shadow of my father, Leone Ginzburg, a philologist, historian, and literary critic." Carlo Ginzburg gained international recognition with his microhistorical research, The Cheese and the Worms, the Cosmos of a 16th-Century Miller, which was published in Italian in 1976 and translated into many languages. In this historical study, focused on a confrontation between the Miller Menocchio and the Inquisition in 16th-century Italy, Ginzburg succeeded in combining expertise and erudition with rare literary talent. In this book, and in the one that preceded it on the Benandanti, Ginzburg showed that the archives of repression do indeed grant access to the authentic voices of the persecuted, and that from the documents of the Inquisition, not only the voices of the inquisitors can be heard, but also the voices of their victims themselves. After publishing these books, Ginzburg was identified as a historian of popular culture who belonged to the Italian microhistorical trend in historiography. However, he rejected this narrow label because it did not correctly define his general conception of history. Quote unquote, "The idea that history from below might become a sort of slogan is for me unpleasant and also uninteresting, because this would mean replacing one orthodox approach to history with another." He completely rejects the view that microhistory is in contradiction with macrohistory or world history. In his view, microhistory is not an alternative, but, quote unquote, an intrinsically comparative approach whose ultimate goal is to open up the possibility for better generalizations. Ginzburg was deeply impressed by Marc Bloch's methodological introduction to his monumental history of rural France, which he translated into Italian while he was still a student. He was especially taken by Bloch's remark that historians working on rural societies must, as often as possible, read history backwards, lire l'histoire à rebours. From Bloch, he also learned to pay particular attention to what the text, that is the historical testimony, says without initially meaning to do so. And he combined this principle with one that he learned from Walter Benjamin, to brush history against the grain. To this he added the conclusion, quote unquote, "Reading historical testimonies against the intentions of the person or persons producing them means supposing that every text includes uncontrolled elements." By the subtitle of his book, Threads and Traces, True, False, Fictive, we come to a matter that preoccupied Carlo Ginzburg from the start, a matter that runs through almost all his historiographical work like a scarlet thread, the connection between history and rhetoric, between history and fiction, between historical and literary writing. In an interview, he commented, quote unquote, "I have been working for 20 years on the competitive relationship between fiction and history. Indeed, in a long series of essays, he has taken note of the value of literature as a tool of knowledge and shown how novelists, too, can present an objective picture of the past by means of the cognitive instruments at their disposal. On this matter, he commented, quote unquote, history was a challenge for novelists like Balzac, for instance, who reacted to this challenge saying, I'll be the historian of the 19th century. But then after him, we have novelists like Stendhal and Flaubert, who challenged historians in their turn. Therefore, in the wake of Eric Auerbach's mimesis, he expanded on this theme in his essay, The Bitter Truth. In a penetrating argument against postmodern criticism and against the tendency to blur the boundary between fiction and history, a tendency that denies the possibility of attaining knowledge of the past, he insists, quote unquote, in spite of the fact that historians are situated people and knowledge is also situated, there is an objective side of things which can be proved and accepted by people working on different assumptions. But historical evidence is not revealed to us directly, and I quote, it should neither be regarded as a sort of window open into social reality, nor an enclosed wall that prevents us from seeing anything beyond the evidence itself, as the postmodernists would say. It's more like a distorting glass, and the problem is to see which way the glass is distorting. In remarks that he made several years ago, Ginzburg emphasized that the thread I started from includes Morelli, Freud, Sherlock Holmes implied homage to a tradition based on critical positivism, which ultimately goes back to the Enlightenment. To this tradition, I do feel deeply indebted. In the face of the skepticism and sometimes even the contempt that is shown these days, and regrettable here in Israel as well, to our historical research and study, it is fitting to conclude with a quotation from the illuminating article by Carlo Ginzburg, Proofs and Possibilities. Among the intellectual devices that permitted us to adapt to our surroundings, both natural and social, transforming them along the way, historiography must also be included. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Kaplan. Thank you very much, Yossi, for this generous and challenging introduction. I feel a great joy and honor in being here. The implicit reference to Martin Buber's dialogic principle in the title of my lecture needs some qualification. In his book, I and Thou, Buber insisted on reciprocity, from prenatal bodily reciprocity between mother and child to living reciprocal relationships as foundations of a genuine community. But the Russian critic Mikhail Bakhtin reinterpreted I and Thou, a book which had a deep impact on him, turning the dialogic principle into a model of asymmetrical, at times contentious relationships. Bakhtin's approach to Dostoevsky's novels as a clash of conflicting worldviews indirectly inspired the work in progress I would like to share with you. I will not focus on Judeo-Christian dialogue, but on a sequence of dialogues between Jews and Christians staged by Christians in a definite time and place, early 18th century England. The spark that ignited the debate I will deal with was a series of tracts published in London between 1727 and 1729, entitled 6 Discourses on the Miracles of Our Savior, followed by 2 defenses. The author, Thomas Woolston, a Cambridge clergyman, bluntly asserted, quote, that the literal history of many of the miracles of Jesus, as recorded by the evangelists, does imply absurdities, improbabilities, and incredibilities, end quote. Therefore, he concluded, the gospel narratives should be interpreted figuratively. The conclusion was not new. Woolston repeatedly said to have been inspired by Origenes and his exegetical approach. The aggressive argument sounded shocking. Woolston's tracts, issued in a quick sequence, became a bestseller. The first discourse was reprinted 5 times in a single year. In the 4th discourse, an additional element was introduced. Commenting on how Jesus turned water into wine at Cana's wedding, Woolston asked, quote, how shall I force nature and faith to ridicule this story? How shall I lay aside that profound veneration for the holy Jesus, which conversation with the fathers, more than the prejudice of education, has begotten in me, and ludicrously here treat him and his miracle too, as is incumbent upon me to make way for the mystery? Unquote. In other words, the tension between ridicule and profound veneration should be solved in order to advance a figural interpretation of Jesus' miracle. Here was Woolston's solution. Quote, in short, I cannot do it in my own name, but having met with a satirical invective of a supposed Jewish rabbi to this purpose, I here publish it, that our clergy, as well as myself, may think of an answer to it, and so prevent that mischief it may do by being handed about among Jews and infidels in manuscripts, unquote. A text followed, in which the supposed Jewish rabbi addressed the Christians by passing sarcastic comments on Jesus' miracles. Some of them, quote, are absurd tales, others foolish facts, others unjust actions, others ludicrous pranks, others juggling tricks, others magical enchantments, unquote. At the wedding in Cana, Jesus, quote, like a punch maker, meliorates water into what they called wine, unquote, offering it to an already drunk audience, and so on and so forth. Woolston made use of this rhetorical strategy over and over again. In the 5th discourse, he commented upon Jesus raising the dead by arguing, quote, if these 3 miracles had not been reported of Jesus, but of Muhammad, in the same disorder of time, by 3 different historians, you would presently have scented the forgery and imposture, unquote. This not so bleak allusion to the famous or infamous tradition of the 3 impostors, Moses, Jesus, Muhammad, surfaced again in a long letter that, Woolston wrote, my old friend, the Jewish rabbi, sent me on Lazarus' resurrection, quote, desiring me to publish it and exhort the clergy to answer it. Otherwise, he would clandestinely hand it about to the prejudice of our religion, whereupon I, rather than Christianity should so suffer, do here publish it, unquote. The tone of Rabbi's letter was once again harsh and sarcastic. quote, a notorious imposture, a fraud which justly provoked the indignation of our ancestors. Lazarus was a confederate with Jesus in the wicked imposture he was putting upon mankind, unquote. These remarks pave the way to the rabbi's conclusion, quote, your divines think they have exhausted that subject and absolutely confuted all objections that can be made against it, but are much mistaken. Sometimes we Jews dip into the writings on this head and always smile with indignation at their foolish invectives against the blindness of the eyes and hardness of the hearts of our ancestors. If they would but favor us with a liberty to write for ourselves, a reasonable liberty, which in this philosophical age we don't despair of, especially under so wise and good a civil administration as this nation is happily blessed with, we would cut them out some more work, unquote. I would like to look at Woolston's discourses from a general perspective. The two cardinal and complementary traits of verbal behavior, Roman Jakobson once wrote, are, quote, that inner speech is in its essence a dialogue, and that any reported speech is appropriated and remolded by the quoter, whether it is a quotation from an altar or from an earlier phase of the ego, said I, unquote. So far, I've relied upon the second trait mentioned by Jakobson, since I quoted, and therefore appropriated and remolded, passages from Woolston's speeches or texts. Woolston did the same, quoting, appropriating, and remolding the Jewish rabbis' speeches or texts, but with a difference. In the series of textual Chinese boxes I've been piling up, the innermost box, the rabbi's invective, had been introduced with a wink, that is, the adjective supposed, a distantiating device comparable to a grisaille detail inscribed in a Renaissance painting. Later, as we have seen, the supposed Jewish rabbi became my old friend, the Jewish rabbi. The wink persisted, but the tone shifted from the jocular, the comment on the miracle at Cana, to the emotional, the comment on Lazarus' resurrection. The rabbi's letter confronted the reader with an inner speech at two different levels. On the one hand, Woolston, a Christian clergyman, addressed other Christians on behalf of the voiceless Jews. On the other, the fictitious rabbi spoke on behalf of Woolston, giving voice to the latter's moral and intellectual commitment to reject Jesus' miracles as being fraudulent, sometimes ludicrous, always objectionable. Woolston's half-repressed voice came out through his alter ego, the Jewish rabbi, a device aimed at circumventing the danger of persecution through a transparent compromise formation. We could compare the rabbi and his objections to the role played by the devil's advocate in Catholic canonization trials, a comparison which Woolston, the dissenting Anglican clergyman, would have utterly disliked. Jakobson's remark on inner speech as a general trait of human language may help us to approach inner speech as a historical phenomenon, performed within a specific context. As we have seen, Woolston's attack on the literal interpretation of Jesus' miracles was a succès de scandale, its scandalous content being reinforced by its scandalous form, ostensibly justified by the use of satirical genre. But Woolston's discourses were not quite as straightforward as they seemed. Their reception should not be taken for granted. Those writings found an audience which had been trained to decipher them. But how? A tentative answer to this question might rely upon some contextually based guesswork. Following in the footsteps of Michael Baxendall's splendid book on 15th-century Italian painting, I would argue that a message, a painting, a text, can be deciphered by its audience or audiences, insofar as it implicitly relies upon a series of shared social experiences, taking the word experience in its broadest possible sense. The dialogue staged by Woolston between his own authorial voice and the Jewish rabbi might have had a familiar ring for an audience used to watching actors performing complex ambivalent roles on stage, Shylock, for instance. But in late Stuart England, theatre intersected with other public spheres, the coffee house, Grub Street. Let me focus on an example from the latter, the bustling world of booksellers and publishers. In 1692, one of them, John Dunton, started an Athenian society to promote the Athenian Gazette, or Casuistical Mercury, later entitled the Athenian Mercury, a weekly periodical which claimed to solve, quote, all the most nice and curious questions proposed by the ingenious, unquote. Among its many contributors was Jonathan Swift, who sent in a conventional poem. In its 20 volumes, the Athenian Mercury published hundreds of anonymous questions on cases related to divinity, history, philosophy, mathematics, love, poetry. Each of them followed by detailed anonymous answers. Dunton is credited with the invention of the advice column. A few years later, the equally anonymous author of a text entitled History of the Athenian Society, that is, Charles Gildon, acting as a spokesman of Dunton himself, praised the undertaking in emphatic terms. Quote, England has the glory of giving rise to two of the noblest designs that the wit of man is capable of inventing, and they are the Royal Society for the experimental improvement of natural knowledge and the Athenian Society for communicating not only that, but all other sciences to all men as well as to both sexes, unquote. One of the most notable features of the Athenian Mercury was actually the participation of women in it. The front page of a supplement to the Athenian Oracle, a 3-volume anthology published in 1703, was framed by 4 vignettes labeled Athens and Rome, Oxford and Cambridge. At the center, a table surrounded by a group of smartly dressed ladies and gentlemen. The references to ancient Greece, Athenian society, the Athenian Mercury, involved, the front page suggested, a definite progress. The title of the periodical had been chosen because, quote, the Athenians were the most curious and inquisitive people of antiquity, unquote. But Aristotle, for instance, addressed himself only to his own select scholars, who were, needless to say, all male. On the contrary, Charles Gildon explained, John Dunton had found out, quote, how to people the thinly inhabited kingdoms of philosophy with a more numerous generation, unquote. At the core of this intellectual and political project, Dunton was a staunch Whig. There was a device, quote, the form of question and answer, the authors of which method the gentlemen of this society are far from pretending to be the only method of satisfying everyone's curiosity and doubts, unquote. Someone, Gildon considered, had compared the Athenian Mercury to an earlier 17th century work written by a Lutheran theologian, Johann Gottfried Heidfeld's Sphinx Theologico-Philosophica, also based on questions and answers. But the analogy was rejected as being superficial. Quote, for there, the author proposes his difficulties and solves them himself, but with an endless number of vulgar errors, grounding all his answers on ill authorities, school divinity, and those antiquated systems of philosophy which were composed out of the misunderstood writings of Aristotle, unquote. The ipse dixit, the magisterial argument of some of the old Aristotelians, was on the contrary the target of the Athenian Mercury. Its reader, quote, is only desired to yield to the force of reason itself, unquote, against merely conjectural arguments. The example chosen to illustrate this point was the famous Testimonium Flavianum, the alleged reference in Flavius Josephus' Antiquities of the Jews to, quote, Jesus, a wise man, a doer of wonderful works, the Christ who drew over to him both many of the Jews and many of the Gentiles, unquote. The passage had been the object of a pointed exchange in one of the issues of the Athenian Mercury. Quote, question. What is your opinion of that famous passage in Josephus in the 4th chapter of the 18th book of his Antiquities that relates to Jesus Christ? Answer. We have reason to doubt the author of this query is rather a deist than a Christian. By the word opinion is cunningly insinuated a dilemma, that is, either the passage is true or false. If true, why so many good testimonies against it as we meet with of late? If false, why is it brought to prove there was such a person as our Savior who lived at such a time, worked miracles, was crucified, and so on? Unquote. This was a lesson in hermeneutics in a nutshell. The audience of the Athenian Mercury, men and women, were taught to read between the lines and to catch nuances and allusions, since any word could conceal a hidden clue. Quote, the author of this query is rather a deist than a Christian, the readers were told. But what about the author of the answer? He went on and on, insinuating doubts, suggesting that a careful checking of the evidence would show that the passage was a late addition. Ultimately, the readers were left with a demanding task to pass an independent judgment about an issue so hotly debated by theologians and scholars. Their whole design, the history of the Athenian society pointed out, is to improve knowledge in divinity and philosophy in all their parts, as well as philology in all its latitude, unquote. 20 years later, Giambattista Vico, the Neapolitan philosopher, also insisted on the cognitive potential of philology in a broad sense. But to spread this argument in the Kingdom of Naples through a weekly periodical would obviously have been unthinkable. The Athenian society connected its favorite device, questions and answers, to a long tradition going back to remote antiquity, from Cicero's Tusculanae Questiones to Plato's dialogues, to the hard questions the Queen of Sheba addressed to Solomon. But this long continuity implied a discontinuity as well. Quote, the good of mankind was not the aim of the Grecian philosophers so much as their own personal glory and pride, since they communicated learning to any but their immediate hearers, unquote. The printing press had created a different kind of communication. The Royal Society had set a different standard. Behind the Athenian Society and its weekly organ, the Athenian Mercury, one can see a distant, imposing model, Newton. The second volume of the anthology, The Athenian Oracle, paid an implicit homage to Newton and his famous dictum, hypothesis non fingo, I frame no hypothesis, in a poem addressed to the Athenian society, which proclaimed, quote, no dark conjecture, no obscure suppose confounds the knowledge of each hidden cause, unquote. No hidden causes, but cases, like those debated through anonymous questions and answers by the Athenian Mercury, the weekly periodical born as the Athenian Gazette or casuistical Mercury. Cases of all kinds, frivolous, ludicrous, serious, paradoxical. The questions, presented at random, ranged from courtship to geometry, from theology to inheritance, from bees to Stonehenge, from corals to Hottentots, and so on. Some of the questions addressed controversial issues like the following, quote, whether a Christian magistrate can tolerate the Jews since their expectation of a triumphant Messiah is a direct blasphemy against Jesus Christ, unquote. A long, nuanced answer followed, which included many detailed digressions. In one of them, the blood libel was discussed in detail and finally rejected as a slander against the Jews. Quote, how often do we find accounts in history of their false imprisonments and cruel death, unquote. A case, Andrei Yolles wrote, is different from both illustration, Beispiel, and example, insofar as, quote, it asks a question without being able to provide an answer. It imposes on us the duty of making a decision without delivering us the decision's content, unquote. The Athenian Mercury apparently offset the disruptive potential of the genre, insofar as its casuistical approach was combined with questions and answers. But the same questions could receive different answers in different issues of the periodical. For instance, Josephus' alleged passage on Jesus was discussed on 3 different occasions. Once, arguing that it was a late forgery. Twice, that it was authentic, along with a detailed presentation of the arguments for and against. Typically, a question addressed the very act of arguing. Quote, what rule there be given to measure reason by? I ask this. In regard, we oftentimes meet with much confidence in arguments, both on the one side and the other, each party contending is reason at best. In argument and controversy, each party contradicts the goodness of the other's reasoning, concluding his rule is straight, but the other's is crooked. Answer. Reason itself is the rule of arguments, not of itself. For that's impossible. The question should have been, what is the rule of what appears reasonable? Then our answer had been a demonstration of just consequences drawn from true premises, unquote. Reason as a regulative principle of intellectual debates. Experimental knowledge as a challenge to traditional authority. Knowledge spread to the humankind, overcoming gender distinctions. We recognize the distinctive features of the Enlightenment, the philosophical age, as Woolston, or more precisely, his disguised spokesman, called it. Let's go back to their fictitious dialogue. In his 6th discourse, Woolston addressed the greatest miracle of all, Jesus' resurrection, objecting that, quote, if it was impossible to evade the guards of the sepulchre, then there was a real resurrection. But if there was but a bare possibility of evading them, then this answer is of no force, unquote. This was, in a nutshell, the argument that some years later David Hume developed in his essay on miracles. A miraculous event can be accepted if, and only if, its disproval would imply an even greater miracle. But Woolston looked for a more aggressive argument. Declaring his own insufficiency, he asked his old friend, the Jewish rabbi, to send his thoughts on Jesus' resurrection, but abstaining from all ludicrousness, satire, and banter. The result was a long letter, which Woolston duly published, purged of a few puns and conundrums. Some of them, however, remained. I cannot read the story without smiling, the rabbi remarked. And there are 2 or 3 passages in it that put me in mind of Robinson Crusoe, filling his pockets with biscuits when he had neither coat, waistcoat, nor breeches on. Sometimes I think your evangelists wanted wit to adapt that tale to sense and to accommodate the transaction to nature. And sometimes I think them crafty and were-minded, like Daniel Defoe in his aforesaid romance, to put the banter upon the credulity of mankind with some disguised and latent absurdities, unquote. This was clearly too much. Woolston, accused of blasphemy, was put on trial and sentenced to a fine he was unable to pay. He rejected to compromise and remained in jail. There he died, victim of an unspecified illness in 1733. Woolston's fate elicited comments all over Europe, among others from Voltaire. But in 1729, when he was still alive, his discourses had already been the object of a heated debate that involved, among others, 2 Anglican bishops. In a massive 2-volume attack, a vindication of the miracles of our blessed Savior, Richard Smallbrook, Bishop of St. David's, dismissed Woolston's sarcastic tone as ultimately irrelevant. Even the greatest of human performances, Smallbrook pointed out, such as Homer's and Virgil's poems, have been in fact burlesqued, though without lessening the veneration of the word for them. But as allegories prove anything out of anything, so burlesque proves nothing but an absence of wit, and much less can it desecrate anything that is sacred or falsify anything that is true, unquote. Smallbrook was possibly reacting to the disparaging parallel advanced by Woolston through his old friend, the Jewish rabbi, between the Gospel's narrative on the resurrection of Jesus and Defoe's Robinson Crusoe. But Smallbrook's move was not without consequences. To argue that the Gospels were, like Homer's and Virgil's poems, above parody, implied, if not a desecration, a fundamental analogy among them, and therefore a secular approach to the sacred text. In other words, to accept Woolston's challenge, engaging a dialogue with him, and using his literary devices, first of all, the dialogue, might have had unforeseeable consequences. They vividly come out in an anonymous work, The Trial of the Witnesses of the Resurrection of Jesus, whose huge success is witnessed by its 13 editions. Its author, Thomas Sherlock, Bishop of Bangor, imagined a group of gentlemen debating about Woolston's case. To settle their dispute, they stage a mock trial based on an examination of the evidence concerning the resurrection of Jesus. More precisely, quote, the matter before the court was whether the objections produced by Mr. Woolston are of weight to overthrow the evidence of Christ's resurrection, unquote. Two gentlemen, Mr. A and Mr. B, debate the case before a judge and a jury. Mr. A reworks, with some variations, the rabbi's argument conveyed by Woolston. The resurrection of Jesus was a fraud enacted by his disciples. Mr. B argues for the reality of Jesus' resurrection, considering it, quote, as a fact which happened but last year. The mere antiquity of the resurrection I give up. For if the evidence was not good at first, it cannot be good now, unquote. Authority and tradition did not play any role in the fictitious debate. Mr. A argued that the witnesses of the resurrection of Jesus were guilty of mendacity. Mr. B defended their veracity. At the end of the dialogue, the jury unanimously declared the apostles not guilty. But the conclusion of the trial of the witnesses of the resurrection of Jesus was possibly less relevant than the dialogue itself. Quote, whoever was the author of this treatise, Woolston commented in one of his defenses, God knows, but he's certainly a friend to my objections against Jesus' resurrection, which he has fairly stated, but is so far from fully computing all of them that he discovers a consciousness here and there that they are unanswerable, unquote. Maybe Woolston would have changed his mind if he had known that the anonymous work had been written by the Bishop of Bangor. Maybe, or maybe not. The ambiguous implications of Sherlock's literary device were pointed out a few years later in 1732 by his French translator, Abraham Lemoine. In a long introduction to Les Témoins de la Résurrection de Jésus-Christ, mostly devoted to Woolston's life and writings, Lemoine anticipated a possible objection. Quote, why should we propagate in the world a system as obnoxious as Mr. Woolston's? Are we not contributing to spread irreligion and ungodliness? Would it not be preferable to leave all those abominations to an eternal oblivion? Unquote. Lemoine's answer to both questions was negative. Woolston's arguments against the resurrection of Jesus deserved to be mentioned in full in order to be rejected, insofar as Christian religion is founded on reason. But were not the objections raised by the Jewish rabbi aimed to undermine the gospel's narrative in the name of reason or common sense, as distinct from authority? I began my talk mentioning Martin Buber's I and Thou and Mikhail Bakhtin's reading, in fact, reworking of Buber's dialogic principle. As you may have noticed, as soon as I began to unfold my argument, I approached both Buber and Bakhtin, Buber through Bakhtin, from the vantage point of a third thinker, Leo Strauss. In his groundbreaking essay, Persecution and the Art of Writing, Strauss mentioned some hermeneutic rules, arguing that they may help us to understand philosophical texts written between antiquity and the end of Ancien Regime. One of Strauss' rules read, quote, one is not entitled to delete a passage, not to amend its text, before one has fully considered all reasonable possibilities of understanding the passage as it stands, one of these possibilities being that the passage may be ironic. The views of the author of a drama or dialogue must not, without previous proof, be identified with the views expressed by one or more of his characters, or with those agreed upon by all his characters, or by his attractive characters, unquote. Persecution and the Art of Writing was originally published in 1941. it began mentioning, quote, a considerable number of countries which, for about 100 years, have enjoyed a practically complete freedom of public discussion, that freedom which is now suppressed and replaced by a compulsion to coordinate speech with such views as the government believes to be expedient or holds in all seriousness, unquote. Leo Strauss' implicit reference to Nazi Germany and fascist Italy was obvious, although a few pages later, he also imagined a historian living in a totalitarian country obliquely attacking the government-sponsored interpretation of the history of religion, unquote, presumably an allusion to the Soviet Union. Following in Strauss' footsteps, one might focus on the political context in which Bakhtin proposed his dialogic perspective, as well as, on a more general level, on the political implications of the combined use of irony and dialogic strategies in a long tradition from Plato onwards. Two books, published anonymously in 1729, forcefully illustrate the fruitfulness of Strauss' approach. Both of them have been attributed to Anthony Collins, the advocate of free thinking, who died at the very end of that year. The first, a discourse concerning ridicule and irony in writing, did not mention Woolston, but remarked that the use of banter, irony, ridicule, and sarcasm, particularly in religious matters, was fully legitimate. A quotation from Shaftesbury followed, quote, if men are forbid to speak their minds seriously about certain subjects, they will do it ironically, unquote. The second book included in its title a double tongue-in-cheek allusion to Collins' most famous works, a dialogue between Mr. Grounds and Scheme and Tom Woolston, in which the insincerity, inconsistencies, and absurdities contained in the latter's discourses on the Savior's miracles are fully detected and proved. The title sounded straightforward and aggressive, but what followed had an ambiguous ring to it. The dialogic format gave Woolston, as a fictional character, the opportunity to advance his real arguments in detail and to comment on them with a sarcastic laugh. Quote, but how do you like my last piece just published? Does it not sap the very root and foundation of the letter of Christianity? My honest friend, the Jewish rabbi, destroying in an instant the story of Christ's resurrection, or the mighty miracle, unquote. The refutation of Woolston's and the rabbi's arguments looks weaker than the arguments themselves. Mr. Grounds, one of Woolston's fictional opponents, has the last word, although he does not stress the truth of Christianity, but the social usefulness of religion, of any religion. Quote, consider how by the destruction of religion, you, Woolston, encourage men in their vices and debaucheries. You plunge them in all the disorders and immoralities the world can afford, and in the end occasion their utter ruin and destruction. Unquote. A few years after Woolston's death in prison, his literary strategy was developed in a different direction. A long book entitled A Dialogue Between Philaletes, a Christian deist, and Theophanes, a Christian Jew, appeared in 1737. The author, Thomas Morgan, a dissenting preacher of humble origins, close to the Quakers, also practiced medicine and published on both theological and medical topics. In the front page of the dialogue, Morgan concealed himself under a pseudonym, the moral philosopher, reinforced by a motto taken from Elihu's speech in the book of Job, quote, there is reason in man, and the inspiration of the Almighty gives him understanding, unquote. In the authorized version of the Bible, the passage read, there is a spirit in man, and the inspiration of the Almighty gives him understanding. Reason versus spirit. Thomas Morgan's defiant gesture point at a deep chasm which would have marked the intellectual history of Europe. Luther's translation of the same passage, Geist, leads to Hegel. But although the moral philosopher raised reason as a flag on the very threshold of his book, the meaning of the word in this context is not self-evident. The names of the two participants in the dialogue look, on the contrary, quite transparent as soon as the reader realizes that Philalitis, the lover of truth, defeats the arguments put forward by Theophanes, Epiphany. Love of truth, supported by love of wisdom, philosophy, is presented as superior to God's manifestation or God's revelation. But Philalitis is labeled a Christian deist. Theophanes, a Christian Jew. They both belong to Christianity. What are they debating about? The first point of disagreement is Paul and his ambivalent attitude towards the law. In Paul's writings, the word law, Philalitis points out, has different meanings. Sometimes, quote, he means the law of nature as originally written upon the heart, or that universal, eternal, and immutable wisdom, reason, moral truth, or righteousness, which being objectively proposed to the understanding must be the same rule or measure of action to every intelligent being alike, unquote. A distinct echo of Job's passage chosen as a motto for the dialogue should not be missed. But sometimes Paul, quote, by the word law means the moral law given by Moses to the people of Israel as the civil or political law of that nation. All its sanctions were merely temporal, relating only to man's outward practice and behavior in society, unquote. This law, Philalitis points out, quote, secure civil rights and properties of the society, but could not relate to the inward principles and motives of action, whether good or bad, unquote. Hence, Paul's harsh judgment about the law and its limitations. He, quote, preached a new doctrine contrary to Moses and the prophets, unquote. This conclusion, Theophanes objects is untenable, quote. That Christ himself, as well as St. Paul, undertook to justify the gospel scheme upon the foot of Moses and the prophets is as clear as daylight, unquote. Paul never set up a new revelation in opposition to the old. Philalitis is not surprised. This is the, quote, common hypothesis and most prevailing scheme among the Christians, unquote. We are not surprised either. Theophanes, the Christian Jew, is obviously a Christian, a Protestant Christian. But why does Philalitis claim to be not simply a deist, a follower of the religion of nature, but a Christian deist? This point surfaces in the dialogue over and over again. Paul, the preacher of the new doctrine, was, Philalitis explains, quote, the great free thinker of his age, the bold and brave defender of reason against authority, in opposition to those who had set up a wretched scheme of superstition, blindness, and slavery, contrary to all reason and common sense. And this under the specious, popular pretense of a divine institution and revelation from God, unquote. Philalitis, the Christian deist, bluntly rejects the notion of revelation, as well as any connection whatsoever with Judaism. Quote, as for Moses and the prophets, though I admire them as politicians, historians, orators, and poets, I have nothing to do with them in religion, as I cannot possibly be of their religion, unquote. A Jew, a Mahometan, a Persian, Indian, or Chinese, he concludes, may be equally sincere with the best Christian and as much in favor of God, unquote. One might argue that Philalethes and Morgan's Christian deism, strongly indebted to Toland's Nazarenus, was ultimately a de-Judaized version of Christianity, synonymous with natural religion. But this conclusion would be hasty. The new doctrine preached by Paul was based on, quote, a figurative, typical, and allegorical sense, unquote, ascribed to Moses and the prophets, rooted in a great revolution in religion among the Jews, which took place after the Babylonian exile, a point which Morgan did not develop, limiting himself to a passing, vague reference to the book of Ezra. More revealing, although puzzling, is the sudden eruption of Rabbi Ben Aaron, whom Philalethes describes as, quote, a man of learning and good sense, and no great bigot to his religion. We shall spend the evening with him, unquote. Their conversation goes unrecorded. The morning after, Theophanes comments, quote, I never heard an argument between two such antagonists managed with more decency, temper, and candor, unquote. He, the Christian Jew, had given to them, quote, a silent attention, unquote. The Jewish rabbi gave Thomas Woolston the opportunity to reject the literal interpretation of the Gospels. Theophanes, the Christian Jew, gave Thomas Morgan the opportunity to reject the literal interpretation of the Bible. In both cases, a formal device, the dialogue, had opened up and justified thinking possibilities. Morgan's commitment to this dialogic culture is witnessed by the anthology of a weekly magazine inspired by the Athenian Mercury. He had edited some years before. The British Apollo, containing 2,000 answers to curious questions in most art and sciences, serious, comical, and humorous, approved by many of the most learned and ingenious of both universities and of the Royal Society, performed by a society of gentlemen, 1708, 1711. A society or club of gentlemen is also mentioned in the introduction of the dialogue which Thomas Morgan published under the pseudonym The Moral Philosopher. For 2 years, they used to meet in a country house, quote, with a design to enter impartially into the consideration of the grounds and principles of religion in general, and particularly of Christianity as a revelation distinct from the religion of nature, unquote. This was, as we have seen, the subject of the dialogue between the Christian deist and the Christian Jew. But the introduction mentions something else, a few principles the gentlemen agreed on. Here is the first, quote, the moral truth, reason, and fitness of actions is founded in the natural and necessary relations of persons and things, antecedent to any positive will and law, and therefore cannot be altered by any positive will, law, or authority whatever, unquote. The word necessary, natural and necessary relations of persons and things raises several questions. They emerge in a long sermon Philalethes delivers in the middle of the dialogue. Some great philosophers and very wise men argue that prayers are ineffective. Quote, God, they say, being infinitely wise and knowing all things, must have foreseen from all eternity everything that could happen, as well as in the moral and natural world. Therefore, God in the one, as well as in the other, when he laid the general scheme, must have established certain general laws. It will be allowed, with regard to the natural world, that God governs it by general laws. And the same reason holds good with respect to the intellectual, intelligent, or moral world. It is evident from the nature and reason of things that there can be no particular interposing providence grounded upon the free actions of man, since there can be no free actions. The whole train of thinking and acting must be necessary, from first to last. The simple idea of perception is necessitated by objects, the judgment by the perception, and the volition or action by the judgment. And all this by an intelligent power acting upon the mind, as much as one body communicates motion to another by a natural, mechanical force, unquote. Who are those unnamed philosophers, those modern sophists, as Morgan calls them? Their speech, framed by quotation marks, is not presented as a literal quotation, but as a caricature. Quote, a piece of reason and ridicule, containing a mixture of truth and falsehood. But behind the caricature, one can see a portrait, the portrait of Spinoza, but a Spinoza who had read Newton. This person existed and had a name. Anthony Collins, the author of a philosophical inquiry concerning human liberty, 1717. Collins' huge library included works by both Spinoza and Newton. Moreover, and more importantly, in his forceful attack against free will, Collins made a specific, albeit implicit, reference to a passage by Spinoza, possibly mediated by Bayle's dictionary. Thomas Morgan identified this Spinozian core within Collins' tract, but then suddenly his target turned into a devil's advocate. Quote, but whatever such a philosopher may imagine, the true state of the question here is not whether God governs both the natural and moral world by stated general laws, but whether he governs the world or not. I must say it again, that the question here is not whether God governs the world by general laws, but whether the world does not support and govern itself by certain inherent, essential powers and properties in the things themselves. And this, in truth and reality, is the question between deists and atheists, and not between Christians and deists, as has been always foolishly and most absurdly supposed, unquote. The Christian Jews have confused the deists with the atheists. But the questions raised by Morgan, the deist, betray a deep anxiety, a deep fascination for the atheist argument. The devil's advocate is tempting, is seductive. His arguments against free will, against providence, cannot be rejected so easily. Morgan goes on and on, pondering them. It is not at all surprising, he says, to whom? To the reader? To himself? That the moral atheist should arise out of the natural one and constitute a creature all of a piece, unquote. But what did Morgan mean by atheism? Who was this creature? Here is Morgan again, quote, the mind of man, say they, allowing for intelligence and conscious action, is governed upon the same principles and laws with matter. A body impressed by two contrary forces as a balance by equal weights must necessarily rest in equilibrio and cannot move at all, either this way or that, quote, unquote. This is and is not Spinoza. One of the objections listed at the end of the second book of Spinoza's Ethics reads, quote, it may be objected if man does not act from free will, what will happen if the incentives to action are equally balanced in equilibrio, as in the case of Buridan's ass? Unquote. Here is Spinoza's answer, quote, I am quite ready to admit that a man placed in the equilibrio described, in tali equilibrio positus, would die of hunger and thirst. If I'm asked whether such a man should not be rather considered an ass than a man, I answer that I do not know, unquote. Morgan turned Spinoza's irony into a caricature of Spinoza. But this is a feature shared to a certain extent by all the characters I've been talking about, from Woolston's Jewish rabbi onwards. A caricature portrays reality by distorting it. quote, if they, that is, the Christian device, would but favor us with the liberty to write for ourselves, the Rabbi said. Following the lead of Martin Buber and Mikhail Bakhtin, we have come across staged dialogues, non-existent dialogues, suffocated dialogues. Our times and places are different from those times and places. We are used to asking questions born from the present to the past. Sometimes we might try to learn from the past how to question our answers to the present. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Ginzburg, for the fascinating lecture. And now I'm going to give you first of all, it's a scroll, and I will read it both in Hebrew and in English. האקדמיה הלאומית הישראלית למדעים, ההרצאה השנתית על שם מרטין בובר, תשע"ג. האקדמיה הלאומית הישראלית למדעים מתכבדת להעמיד תעודת הוקרה זו לפרופסור קרלו גינסבורג, שנשא את ההרצאה השנתית על שם פרופסור מרטין בובר, פילוסוף דגול ורב השפעה, הנשיא הראשון של האקדמיה הלאומית הישראלית למדעים. פרופסור קרלו גינסבורג הוא ההיסטוריונים The Israel Academy, signed by the President and Friedman, the Chairman, the ראש החטיבה למדעי הרוח. The Israel Academy of Sciences and Humanities, Martin Buber Memorial Lecture. The Israel Academy of Sciences and Humanities hereby expresses its appreciation to Professor Carlo Ginzburg for his presentation of the 2013 lecture in memory of Professor Martin Buber. The illustrious and eminent philosopher and first president of the Israel Academy of Sciences and Humanities, Professor Carlo Ginzburg is one of the most outstanding and original historians of our time. Signed, Ruth Arnon, President, and Yochanan Friedman, the chairperson of the Humanities Division.
Thank you.
In addition, there is a medal, the Martin Buber medal. So this is very This is the last lecture, and this is the Einstein Memorial Lecture. So I hope you have room in your bag.
Yes, thank you.
So, again,